Croeso cynnes i chi gyd
A
i
very warm
ddigwyddiad
welcome
arbennig iawn.
to a
Hwnnw,
very
ydy'r
special event.
cymdeithasau
We're in
ddifrifol
the
yr Eisteddfod
Virtual Societies
Amgen yn
Pavilion at the
mesur am rai
Eisteddfod
sydd wedi
Amger. It's
dod
my pleasure
gyda
and
fi i cael
privilege
holi
today
Delyth Jewel
to
a'r
question Delyth
sychadeirydd
Jewel,
newydd y
the
Pwyllgor
new chair of the
Diwylliant
Culture,
Cyfathrebu y
Communications,
Gymraeg,
Welsh Language,
Chwaraeon a
Sport and
Chysylltiadau
International
Rhyngwladol.
Relations Committee.
Delyth, croeso cynnes a
Delyth, a
diolch yn
very
fawr am
warm
ymuno
welcome
gyda
to
fi.
you and thank you for joining
Edrych
us.
ymlaen at ein sgwrs.
I look forward to our
A
conversation.
finna hefyd.
Me
Ma' raid
too.
fi weud,
And I
gobeithio
have
eich
to
credu
say,
rhyw
before
fath
we
o
begin,
ddychmygu fan hyn yn bod ni'n
that I'm
arbennig o
imagining here
gymdeithasau
that we are
Tregaron
on the
Fynadau
Eisteddfod
sy'n yr
field. There's
Eisteddfod yn y
Tregaron
cefndir.
outside and there's
Felly
some
wnawn
of
ni
the
drio dychmygu hynny
Eisteddfod
hefyd.
background noise. So we'll try and imagine that too. Yes, indeed.
Nawr, dwi'n mynd i ddechrau trwy
Now,
roi
I'm going
rhif
to
o'ch
start
cefndir
by
chi.
giving
Wel, yn
some of your
anffodus, cyrsiwiodd
background in
Delyth
terms
gan
of
dderbyn
Delyth's personal
Nghaerffili,
history. She was born
dyfodd
in
hi gynnwys Ystrad
Caerphilly. She grew
Mynach
up
ac
in
yn
Ystrad
ysgol
Mynach
Cwm
and
Cymru ym
attended Ysgol
Mhargoed,
Gyfun
cyn
Cwm
mynd i
Rhymni in
astudio
Bargoed
Mhrifysgol
before going on to study
Rhydychen,
at
lle
Oxford
gorfuodd mewn
University, where
iaith
she
alluoedd
graduated
Saesneg o
in
graddus
English
derbyn
language and
astudiaethau
literature
Celtaidd.
before studying a
Roedd yn
master's
cefndir
degree in Celtic
emosiynol
Studies.
ac
In
roedd yn
terms of a
gyfrannol
professional
addysgol
background, having
ddiwrthrydig
graduated,
ymchwilydd
she
ac
worked
ysgrifennwr o
as a
weithiau i
researcher and
aelodau Senedd Plaid
speechwriter
Cymru
for
yn
Plaid Cymru,
Llangefni gan
members of
arbenigwyd
Parliament
Elfyn
in
Llwyd.
Westminster, led by
Roedd yn
Elfyn
2004
Llwyd.
yn
Now in
etholiadwr
2014, she
ymchwilydd y
won the
flwyddyn am ei
Researcher of the
gwaith i
Year award
bwynhau'r tir a
for her
chynyddu'r
work in
bwrdd
preparing the ground for
ddatguddio a
legislation
thrais
on
domestig.
stalking and
Ar
domestic
ddiwedd
violence.
gweithio
And
i Gyngor
later,
Dosbarth
she
ac
worked for
ActionAid.
CAB and
Yn
Action
2019,
Aid. In
cytunodd Delyth yn heddiw
2019,
fel aelod Plaid Cymru
Ellis
o'r
took the
Senedd
oath as
dros
Plaid Cymru member
gyn-fianrediad
for the
Cymru a
Senedd
dilyn
for
marwolaeth
South Wales East
Steffan
following the
Lewis,
sad death of
sef hefyd
Steffan
yn
Lewis,
llefarydd
and she was
plaid ar
named
Brexit
her
a
party
materion
spokesperson
isel.
on
Yn
Brexit and
2021,
external
mae
affairs. In
ffordd i Delyth
2021,
ddod i
Delyth was
sefydliad
re-elected
Dwyrain
member of
Cymru
Senedd
ac mae wedi
for
bod
South
yn
Wales East, and she
gweithreduolaidd
has
y
been
blaid
appointed a
cyfnewid
party
hinsawdd
spokesperson on
trafnidiaeth
climate
a
change,
eniwi.
transport
Ond
and
yn y
energy.
sesiwn yma, i ni'n mynd i
But
fod
in this session, we
canolbwyntio
are going
yn
to be
fwy
focused
ar y pwyllgor diwylliant
on the
wnes i sôn
Culture
amdano cyn hyn.
Committee that I just
Delyth,
mentioned.
dyma
Now,
y
Delyth,
cefndir personol ac
that's
addysgol a
your
gwleidyddol sy'n rhan
personal,
o'ch bywyd.
educational and
Ond
political
cwestiwn
background in
dechrau
terms of your
falle,
career. But a
o
first question,
ran
perhaps, in
eich
terms
cefndir chi, o ran
of
beth nath eich
your
ysbrydoli chi
background and
i
what
newid
inspired you
i fyd
to
fel byd Cymru.
enter politics.
Wel, fi'n meddwl achos rwy'n ymddiddori cymaint
Well,
mewn pobl,
I
fi'n
think
clywed mwy am
I'm
bobl, clywed eu straeon,
interested in
clywed
people. I want to learn more about
yn
people, hear their
amlwg
stories, and see how I can help them clearly. But
trwy be fi 'di
if
wneud
there is a
trwy'r
thread
cyfrifiad
running through my
scientific o
career
ran
before coming to the
straeon bobl,
Senedd, it was about
straeon
people's
pobl, straeon
stories,
bechgyn,
telling people's
i
stories,
falle
trying to
ddim wedi
give
cael eu stori yn cael eu clywed
those
o'r blaen.
people who
Felly,
haven't been
dyna
heard in the
beth
past a platform.
dywedais i
So that's what's
a bod
inspired
o'n
me,
ffordd o
and that's why I am
i
so
roi
excited
mentrau
to be
pwyllgor
doing this
dysgu
work with
i
this new
gyd
committee,
wedi bod yn hollbwysig. Ond
which will be
y peth
crucially
yw,
important, of course, but it's
pan
people's
fi'n gofyn i
stories
rywun
and engaging people
Wel, fi'n siŵr bod pobl yn ymddiddori mewn
and ensuring that
gweld y
people take
podlediad
an
yma
interest in
yn
politics and see that
un i
politics is
gyd.
something that
Dim ond
belongs
yn
to us
unig ffordd
all,
pobl sydd yn
not
bodloni dan y
just to
blaenoriaeth
people who already know a great deal about it already. If there's anything I can do through the committee's work to help us to engage more with the people of Wales, then that's what I'm very
Felly o
eager
ran
to
y
do.
pwyllgor yma, be nath chi
So in terms of
ddisgwyl
this
cyn dod yn
committee,
ôl y cadeirydd
what
heddiw?
inspired you to
Fi'n meddwl
apply for the role of
y
chair?
modd, achos, wel,
Well, the
fi'n
main
meddwl
reason was, and each of the areas that you covered and you set out, Angharad, the scope of the committee's work is very broad indeed, and each of these areas is extremely important for the future of Wales. Things such as culture, the Welsh language, international relations, sport, they are the things that bring joy to people's lives. And I want to ensure that through the committee's work, the Welsh Government's policies won't be peripheral and that they are at the very heart of how we recover from the pandemic, certainly, but also how we continue to build our nation. But again, there is a thread running through all of these areas contained within the committee's remit, and that's communications and links between different communities, languages, cultures. Sport is clearly something that brings people together, and international relations, of course, connects us all on a global level. And I think that's crucially important for politics. It needs to be central, but those links and communications aren't necessarily central unless people actually fight for them and ensure that they are strong. So to strengthen those, I felt very passionate that I wanted to take a prominent role within this committee's work for many of the reasons that I've already set out. But mainly,
Ond mae'r cylch
it's
golchwyr yn
communicating with
unig
people.
mor eang.
But the remit
Ond
is
mae'n
so
rhaid i chi,
broad.
ganddoch chi rhai
I'm
blaenoriaethau.
sure you must have some
Pa
priorities of your own.
pa
So
ran o'r
which
teitl
part
eang hwn
of
fydd
that
eich blaenoriaethau?
broad-reaching title will be your priority? Well, I think it'll be crucially important for the committee to ensure that we don't prioritize one area at the expense of any other. And I agree with you entirely that that will be one of the challenges for us to ensure that we do provide balance and recognition to all of these areas. But as I've set out, I think all of these issues are linked. If we look at international relations, for example, I think it will be important to see what the Welsh Government does in order to promote cultural or sporting links on the international stage. So I do think that there are ways of ensuring that we look at each and every one of these aspects in an interconnected way. But in terms of some of our early priorities as a committee, then certainly we have issued a consultation for the public, and I'm sure we can discuss that in more detail later, because we do want to hear people's views on this. But the fact that we're having this discussion over Zoom rather than on the Eisteddfod field, as hopefully we will be next year, the fact that we're doing all of these things does demonstrate how much technology and communications have changed over the past year. And it also reminds us all how much of an impact the pandemic has had on society and on each and every one of us. Now, so many of these areas within the committee's remit, particularly culture and sport, and communications too, but in terms of the sectors themselves, the pandemic will have had a huge impact on the industries involved and on those individuals working or volunteering in these sectors. So I do think that we do have to build on the work of our predecessor committee that looked at so many of these issues and ensure that the government does provide the necessary attention to these sectors when we exit the pandemic. And of course, there's also the impact of Brexit. COVID and Brexit are clearly going to be major issues for us. But there are so many things that we're excited to do, but we do want to ensure that we hear people's views, that we hear from stakeholders, and that's why this is the beginning of that conversation. If that can inspire people to get in touch with us and say, well, why aren't you considering this? We'd be delighted to hear from people. Well, you mentioned that you'd launched a consultation over the summer. We might as well move to that now. So what is that consultation? And is there scope for people to participate within it? Most certainly, yes. We wanted to be in the vanguard, as it were, as we enter the summer recess. We want to hear from stakeholders, as I've already said, but importantly, we also want to hear from the public. We want to hear from people, the length and breadth of Wales. We want to hear from people in schools. We want to hear from those in the workplace, those perhaps who aren't working, and people of all ages, because we do have to ensure that the committee's work is something that belongs to all of the people of Wales, particularly if we look at our remit, for example, culture. Now, culture is for everyone. That's something I'm hugely passionate about, because sometimes people think, well, no, culture is only for people who want to go to the opera, let's say. But no, culture covers everything, and it's something that does have to be something where people understand and see that they do have some sort of stake in it and connection with it, and I want to hear the public's views on all of these things. So some of the things that we've already discussed, such as COVID-19 and the impact of the pandemic, well, we want to hear from people working in sectors such as culture, sport and communications as to what the impact has been and what they want to see from government as we hopefully move out of the pandemic. We want to hear from people about the impact of Brexit too. Now, it may be performers or people involved with sport. It may be people working in digital. There are so many different issues where we want to know what the situation is. The predecessor committee did a great deal of important work looking at this, but so much has changed since then. So it was very important for us that we didn't take for granted that we knew what the situation was. We want to hear from stakeholders. We want to hear from those that have been impacted by these phenomena. But also, we want to hear from the public who perhaps don't work in these sectors, but are just interested in these areas. And we want to know what they feel passionately about, what they want us to be looking at. And again, this is something that's important in politics more generally, but it's also extremely important for this committee. We must ensure that people feel ownership of what we are discussing in the Senedd. The Senedd isn't just a building in Cardiff Bay, and if you're not part of the bubble, you're not part of what's going on there. No, our work should enhance our nation, and that's why it's so important for us to hear from the people of Wales. It doesn't matter which part of Wales you live in, it doesn't matter which language or languages you speak. If you live in Wales, then this is your parliament, and we are your committee, and we want you to be involved with our work. Well, that's so very interesting, because I do think that there is a tendency for us all to think about democracy as something that happens every so many years when we have an opportunity to vote. And once we have voted and a party's been elected to govern, well, that's it. There's nothing we can do until the next election comes around. So hearing this message is very interesting, and it's very important too, that we all have a part to play in democracy and in feeding into the work of a committee in a parliament such as this one. But for those perhaps who have no idea where to start, are there specific questions that you'll be asking? Because I can imagine after what you've just told us, be careful, because your inbox will be full to overflowing. Are there specific questions that people can look at online, or is it a matter of people being allowed to make any comment? Well, certainly there are some quite open questions that we have asked as part of the consultation to start that discussion. So we have asked questions on the impact of the pandemic, for example, but when we're talking about the impact of the pandemic, it's not our role to say, well, you have to stick to certain criteria as you respond. No, that's something that we want to hear from people themselves. We want our work to be enhanced by people's comments. But we're also asking about the impact of Brexit, particularly now that an agreement's been struck between the UK and the EU and how things have changed since then. We're also asking about what the Welsh Government's priorities should be, particularly now in terms of the change in context. When the previous committee looked at all of these issues, then sport and international relations wasn't within the remit. So we want to ensure that we as a committee do make those necessary connections in order to bring those issues in. But if people want to learn more about the questions that we've asked, and clearly we want to hear if you have any other ideas that aren't contained within those questions, we'd still want to hear from you. There is information available, and I'll try and get this right. There's information available on the Senedd website, and there's also information available on our social media feeds. So I think it's at Senedd Culture, and if you look at my Twitter feed as Delyth Jewel AM, I'll be retweeting all of these things, so you can find the committee's Twitter address there. And if people want to get in touch with me directly, they're welcome to do that too. But I'm sure the clerks would like me to say that it's better that you do it through official channels, because that's how we can ensure that your ideas can be taken on board and your priorities can be taken on board. In terms of sport, one of the biggest questions now is, why isn't there a Welsh team at the Olympic Games? But perhaps we should leave that there and go on to talk about the challenges that you're facing, because clearly with a title like Culture, Communications, Welsh Language, Sports and International Relations, you mentioned at the outset, Delyth, that you want to cover all of these areas, that you're not prioritizing too much because all of these areas are important, but that's going to pose challenges, surely, because you only have so much time available and you only have so many members available too. So in terms of those major challenges, what are they? Well, in terms of the content of our work, I think we've already discussed some of the challenges that we will be overseeing from a Welsh Government perspective in terms of COVID and Brexit. But in terms of the challenges for us as a committee, one of the challenges that we will face, and I look forward to facing this challenge, is the scale of our remit. And I do think that we will have to look at how all of these areas interlink to ensure that we're not too siloed in the way that we look at the different issues. I think one of the other challenges will be in terms of international relations. There is no designated minister within Welsh Government named as Minister for International Relations. That responsibility now is with the First Minister, which in some ways gives it more status, but others might say, well, it means that there is no individual focused on international relations within the cabinet. So I think one of the early challenges for us will be to find what impact that's going to have on how the government views international issues. But again, when we're talking about challenges, they don't have to be negatives, of course. They can be positive. And there's a very important role for the committee to play as a result of that, so that we can ensure that the oversight of government isn't weakened, and we do have to do justice and meet that challenge. So I think the size of the committee and doing justice to all of the areas covers will be a challenge, and the fact that the new portfolios have been put in place, and we of course want to ensure that we cover all of these bases. But again, we were discussing at the outset how these are the issues and areas that bring people joy. And I think there's a tendency on occasion to think of culture and sport as being at the periphery. They're nice to haves, as they would say. But these are things which are central, well, yes, to our culture, but also as to how we live our lives, how our nation has developed, how we will develop for the future. And I think it'll be a challenge for us to ensure that the government is focused on these issues and that they aren't seen as being peripheral, if that makes sense. And again, I think things do look encouraging, but we do have to keep our focus. Well, yes, of course. And in terms of this question as to whether sport and culture are peripheral, of course they're not. They're at the very heart of the lives of each and every one of us. But again, they tie in very closely with the economy too, because we see someone doing superbly in sailing or mountain biking in the Olympic. That's so important to Wales from an economic perspective as well as a sports perspective. And of course, sports create heroes. And like every nation, we all need our heroes too. Oh, most certainly, yes. And again, it gives people ambition and it brings joy to people's lives. And that is so crucially important. And I should have said too, sorry, I interrupted you there, but I should have also said that in terms of the media, that will also be another challenge for us because there's been so much focus in people's minds over the past 18 months or so on the stories that we hear about our lives here in Wales. That's had a new focus as a result of the pandemic, so that'll be another issue. But our heroes are so very important. Sorry to have interrupted you there. Not at all. Let's move on, therefore, to talk about the importance of broadcasting, and I'll put my hand up here and say that I've appeared before the committee last year talking specifically about the devolution of broadcasting, and a great deal of work was done by the committee on that. How frustrating is it when one period ends, an election takes place, and although recommendations are made in areas such as the devolution of broadcasting, do they lapse after the election? Or is there scope for you now to deliver some of the things that you set out in a document looking at the devolution of broadcasting and how Wales can have the media it needs? And that document was published in March of this year. So is there any way in which one committee can look at what its predecessor committee has done in order to try and move that work forward rather than having to start from the beginning and starting from scratch, as they might say? Well, I think that's a very important question. I do think it's important for us as a committee to be aware and to ensure that it's not, as you say, that things change entirely now and the past is forgotten. We do have to maintain a balance here. We have to take evidence anew, as I've said, and that's why we've issued that consultation for the public on so many different topics. But we also have to build on the work of the predecessor committee because the pandemic has changed the perspective of many people in many different ways in terms of the media landscape. And I think that will enhance the discussion. I think it will bring new perspectives, and therefore we can build on the work that the predecessor committee did. Now, just because there's been an election, and as we've discussed earlier, people do tend to think that perhaps politics is something that happens at particular times and on particular dates, and that there is some sort of vacuum beyond those dates. And that's not the case at all. And I think to do justice to the work of the previous committee, we should certainly take that into account. But it's also very important that we do take new evidence and look at things through a new lens too, because of what's happened over recent months. Because the situation has changed in so many ways. And as I've said, people will have very different views as to how it's changed, but I wouldn't have thought that anyone would argue that it hasn't changed at all. And that's why I think the important thing is to build on the work of the previous committee, but to look at it through a different lens, perhaps. Well, certainly if one good thing's come out of this pandemic, and maybe there's more than one thing among all of the sadness and tragedy, but one good thing is that people have come to realise that we have a parliament in Wales and that there are things that are governed from Wales, and that we can create our own legislation and that we can be even more successful in doing that rather than being less successful, and that's hugely important. But how difficult is it in terms of some of these areas if they are not devolved? Because that's the whole point with broadcasting, isn't it? The major question is whether broadcasting should be devolved. Now, you discuss these issues, but you're discussing them in an area that relates to culture, the importance of broadcasting and the media for the people of Wales, as they're important in all other nations, of course. But you don't really have any power in these areas. So how do you balance those things? Well, it's a challenge, most certainly. The fact that this committee's title includes communications, I think that's something that makes it clear that it has to be a priority for the Senedd, and that's a cross-party issue. Every party had agreed to this remit. Now, in terms of the fact that broadcasting is not devolved, well, clearly the committee would have to look at how we can collaborate with similar committees in Westminster. I think we can certainly look at continuing to work closely with broadcasters. I know that the previous committee had a very constructive relationship with broadcasters, and that's something that we're very eager to maintain. But although the area is not devolved, and as we know, and as people listening to this conversation in the virtual Eisteddfod will be aware, just because something is not devolved, it doesn't mean that it's a black and white issue. There are so many impacts which have an impact on all of our lives. So something like broadcasting, it's about the way we see ourselves. It's about the way we see stories portrayed, if they're stories about Wales or about the rest of the UK or whatever else it may be. It has an impact on all of us. It impacts on how we view ourselves and how we portray ourselves. So they're very complex issues, and they're not issues that we can say, well, because this is not devolved, we won't look at it at all. So I do hope that as a result of the pandemic, we will have constructive discussion and debate with stakeholders on what should happen and what the impact of the past 18 months has been on this area. Now, clearly the committee's not taken evidence on this yet, and we haven't come to an opinion, but certainly it's going to be a contentious issue. I think we can all agree on that. But I very much hope that our work will enhance what the government decides to do in future. Well, one of the things that always surprises me, of course, is that when you think about something like Welsh language broadcasting, which is so important to us in Wales, that we are so very reliant on someone in London who's perhaps never been to Wales, making decision as to what funding should be available to our Welsh language channel. But that's enough from me. I'll get off my soapbox, but I'm sure the committee will look at that. That was my question there. But in terms of being chair, now clearly, Delyth, you have a strong view on many of these issues, not just broadcasting perhaps, but also sport, culture, international relations. So what's the role of a chair in terms of striking that balance between saying, okay, I'm a Plaid Cymru member, I have very strong views and I believe passionately about certain things, but the committee is a cross-party committee. So do you have to reach some sort of consensus, or does the chair have a little more power in that scenario? Well, I think the role of the chair is to steer the committee's activities, most certainly, but one of the reasons I wanted to be chair is that I really do see the value and appreciate the value of cross-party working. When I was working in Westminster, I was very fortunate when I was working for Elfyn Llwyd. Elfyn chaired a cross-party group, and this was the first time that this happened. There was a cross-party consultation in Westminster, which was independent. We didn't go through the usual channels, we set it up ourselves. And every party came together and we looked at laws around stalking. And we considered whether victims were getting justice, and we decided that they weren't. And as a result of the work that we did then back in 2010-11, now, the law wouldn't have changed if we hadn't worked on a cross-party basis. It simply wouldn't have happened, because on such a sensitive issue, on an issue that went beyond party politics, we needed to create a space so that we could collaborate. And that taught me a very important lesson. And certainly I have very strong principal views on many of these issues, and I feel passionately about them. But I also understand the committee's role to ensure that we do reach a consensus and that there are some things that have to be beyond party politics. So I would want to make sure that everyone on the committee has a voice, that everyone feels that their views are appreciated, but also that we can have those difficult discussions and come to a consensus. Because in the Senedd, in Westminster, and in Westminster far more than the Senedd, perhaps, you have the theatre of what happens in the chamber. You certainly in PMQs in Westminster, there's a great deal of furore, and there's a space for that in politics. And if people like me feel very strongly about issues, then we will make that clear. But in a committee room, that's something that's where I'm very aware as chair that I would be representing the Senedd, not representing my party. So in order to do justice to these hugely important topics, I have to ensure that we reach that consensus and push for the right things that need to happen with the support of all parties. It's not something that'll always be easy, I'm sure. Politics can be difficult, and sometimes the difficult issues are the most important ones, and I want to ensure that we get those right. Well, this is so very revealing, of course, because once again, in terms of how politics and democracy works within our country, I think very few people would realize that these cross-party committees are so very important, because we do tend to think that the party in government is the only one that has any sort of voice. So that's very interesting for us all to consider, in terms of, even if you have a party of a particular colour in government, that's not the only way that things operate, and that people can have an influence in so many different ways. And perhaps that's why it's so important in Wales, and that we do have a fairer system of electing our politicians to the Senedd. Well, yes, and that's an area that's out with the remit of this particular committee, but it's certainly something that I tend to agree with you on. But 5 years, which is the term of this Senedd, is a very long time. It's a long time until the next election, and the government that's in power does have to act in the interest of all of the people of Wales, and the committees and every committee within the Senedd are there not only for politicians, not only for the Senedd and the Senedd itself, they're there for all of the people of Wales. And I think that there's a hugely important role for the committees in reaching out to people, in seeking the views of the public on various topics, and to input that information in order to ensure that we have another way of ensuring that the government hears people's voices and hears people's stories, and takes other things into account when we decide how we'll vote and how the government decides on its priorities. So yes, I agree with you. I do think that committees have a crucial role, not only in scrutinizing government, but also in informing the government and inputting ideas and providing a platform for certain ideas so that the government is aware of them. What about the committee's operation in terms of virtual working, or will you be meeting face to face? How would it all work for the future after what we've been through?
wedi newid cymaint o
Well,
bethe.
COVID has changed so many things, and this is one of the areas where we need to strike a balance. In our first committee meeting, the majority of members felt strongly, well, all members, I think, felt strongly that when this is the right thing to do, that we should be able to continue to use Zoom sessions or hybrid sessions so that we can hear from more people who perhaps wouldn't be able to travel to Cardiff to give evidence, whilst simultaneously many people feel much more comfortable meeting face to face. So that'll be one of the challenges for me as chair, to strike that balance, to ensure that we empower more people to provide evidence and to participate in our work, and also to ensure that we take public health into account too, but also the well-being of the public. And that is a multifaceted thing, and we'll have to ensure that we strike the balance correctly. You've already mentioned that predecessor committees had been discussing culture, the Welsh language and communications, but what makes this committee special is that there are two new, hugely important areas as part of your portfolio, Never Sport and International Relations. So how exciting is it to be leading a committee, to chair a committee where there are topics that in the past haven't been within the committee remit? Does that give you a clean slate and give you an opportunity of thinking of new ways of working and leading in different ways? Well, yes, I'm hugely excited. I'm hugely excited about each and every one of the committee's responsibilities. But in terms of those new ones, international relations, well, I used to work for Action Aid, which was a charity working the global south in empowering people and telling people stories. So international relations is very close to my own heart, and sport, well, we've had a summer, well, we're in the middle of a summer of sport. And again, I think it's something that makes people feel happier within themselves. It makes people feel passionate. So I think there's real potential for this committee to perhaps reach out to more people. Again, we've been discussing how we can ensure that we connect people with politics. And because of the issues covered by this committee, I think that we will be able to reach more people that perhaps haven't engaged so much with politics in the past. And the fact that sport is included in the same committee as culture, Welsh language, and international relations, then that all makes sense, doesn't it? It all dovetails together. And again, there is so much potential as to how we can look at sport and the Welsh language together, or media and the Welsh language, and culture and sport together. So I feel very excited. I'm very aware, of course, of the responsibility I have to ensure that we cover this huge remit, but I feel extremely excited as to what we can deliver. And I do think that there are major important things that this committee will be able to do. And from a personal perspective, Delith, how on earth do you have time to do everything that you do? Because clearly, as a member of the Senedd, you have to deal with everyday questions that concern people. You're a public figure, you're that link representing a very broad region. So there are all of those issues that you deal with. And then again, you're a member of a party and you represent that party in the Senedd. And then there's the work that you do in the chamber. And now we've heard about the work of this committee, and clearly this could be a full-time job in and of itself. So how does someone like you strike that balance? And how does your diary work, given that there are only 24 hours in any single day? Well, there's a very simple answer to that. Namely, I have excellent support teams for the new committee, the research team, the clerking team, and the engagement team. I've only been working with them for a few weeks, and they are absolutely fantastic. So they will help us so much in ensuring that this work is done well. And in terms of my work as a member of the Senedd, well, I have a brilliant team supporting me. So without those people supporting me, I'm sure I would find it way too much of a challenge. But again, people see politics and we politicians are seen and heard, but there are so many people behind the scenes that are supporting us, and perhaps they don't always get the recognition that they deserve. And with this committee, there's a substantial team of people who will be working on this, and they will be looking in great detail at all of these issues to ensure that we don't miss anything. And they're the people that deserve praise. I can't take the praise for that. And again, I'm sure we've grown so much as a nation. We've had the Senedd for 20 years. I'm sure we need more members too, because there's only so much that one can do, and I'm sure you'd agree with that. Yes, I would. That is something that this Senedd will have to not only consider, I do think we have to take action on that too, because we all as Senedd members are members of more than one committee. So I chair this committee, but I'll also be a member of the Climate Change Committee, and I'm hugely excited about that work too. But in order for members of the Culture, Communications, Welsh Language, Sport and International Relations Committee, for people to really look into these important issues, then I think in future parliaments, then we should be at least considering what benefits would come from having more members, so that all members would be only on one committee and could be truly focused on those particular issues. But at the moment, clearly, we are where we are. And that's why it is so important that our support teams are so fantastic at what they do. Well, if we were in Tregaron in the Eisteddfod, I'm sure we would hear someone outside the door saying that our time was coming to an end, and we'd have crowds gathering outside the door. So to conclude, Delyth, I think the most important point is this consultation, because that's been your main message today. The people of Wales have to engage with the Senedd, and as you've said, you want to hear from the people of Wales. So remind us again, for anyone who wants to input their ideas or ask questions about this particular committee, where can they access that information? And perhaps remind us that organizations, societies can do that, but also individuals can do that too. Exactly, yes, you can look at the Senedd website or look at social media at Senedd Culture, or if people can't find that, then it's delyth.jewel@senedd.cymru. You're welcome to get in touch with me and I can pass those details on to you. But the important thing for us is that our work is informed by stakeholders and people working in these sectors, people whose lives are impacted by that work, but also from people who have ideas, who feel passionately about these issues. Every part of this committee's remit is an area that's going to be crucially important for all of our lives. Things such as culture, the Welsh language, communication, sport, international relations, they're things that belong to us all. We have a responsibility as a committee to listen to you, but please be part of that discussion, be part of the debate. We want to hear from you. You have an important voice in politics, so let us ensure that that voice is heard. And hopefully now, Delyth, that we can get back together in Tregaron face to face next year, because I think it would be wonderful to be able to report back on what the committee's been able to achieve in 12 months and to see what you've been able to achieve in terms of your work, but also what the issues that people have raised with you are. I'm sure that if we were on the Eisteddfod field, things such as the Welsh language would certainly be at the forefront, culture too, communications, broadcasting, and so on and so forth. They are all so very important. So let's hope we can come together in a real Societies Pavilion next year in order to have these extremely important discussions. And to conclude, I would just want to wish you all the best, Delyth, you and the committee, because clearly, as you've described over the past 3/4 of an hour, this work is so hugely important for us here in Wales and for Wales as a nation too. So congratulations on being elected chair and all the best with all of your work. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you next year in Tregaron. Excellent.